Chapter 6, Part 1 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Removal to Brunswick, 1850 through 1852, Part 1. Mrs. Stowe's remarks on writing and understanding biography, their appropriateness to her own biography, reasons for Professor Stowe's leaving Cincinnati, Mrs. Stowe's journey to Brooklyn, her brother's success as a minister, letters from Hartford and Boston, arrives in Brunswick, history of the slavery agitation, practical working of the fugitive slave law, Mrs. Edward Beecher's letter to Mrs. Stowe and its effect, domestic trials, begins to write Uncle Tom's Cabin as a serial for the national era, letter to Frederick Douglass, Uncle Tom's Cabin, a work of religious emotion. Early in the winter of 1849, Mrs. Stowe wrote in a private journal in which she recorded thought and feeling concerning religious themes, quote, "It has been said that it takes a man to write the life of a man. That is, there must be similarity of mind in the person who undertakes to present the character of another. This is true also of reading and understanding biography. A statesman and general would read the life of Napoleon with the spirit and the understanding, while the commonplace man plods through it as a task. The difference is that the one, being of like mind and spirit with the subject of the biography, is able to sympathize with him in all his thoughts and experiences, and the other is not. The life of Henry Martin would be tedious and unintelligible to a mind like that of a Richelieu or a Mazarin. They never experienced or saw or heard anything like it, and would be quite at a loss where to place such a man in their mental categories. It is not strange, therefore, that of all biography in the world, that of Jesus Christ should be least understood. It is an exception to all the world has ever seen. The world knew him not. There is, to be sure, a simple grandeur about the life of Jesus which awes almost every mind. The most hardened scoffer, after he has jested and jeered at everything in the temple of Christianity, stands for a moment uncovered and breathless when he comes to the object of its adoration, and feels how awful goodness is, and virtue in her shape how lovely. Yet, after all, the character of the Christ has been looked at and not sympathized with. Men have turned aside to see this great sight. Christians have fallen in adoration, but very few have tried to enter into his sympathies and to feel as he felt." How little she dreamed that these words were to become profoundly appropriate as a description of her own life in its relation to mankind. How little the countless thousands who read, have read, and will read Uncle Tom's Cabin enter into or sympathize with the feelings out of which it was written. A delicate, sensitive woman struggling with poverty, with weary step and aching head, attending to the innumerable demands of a large family of growing children, a devoted Christian seeking with strong crying and tears a kingdom not of this world. Is this the popular conception of the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin? Nevertheless, it is the reality. When, amid the burning ruins of a besieged city, a mother's voice is heard uttering a cry of anguish over a child killed in her arms by a bursting shell, the attention is arrested, the heart is touched. So Uncle Tom's Cabin was a cry of anguish from a mother's heart, and uttered in sad sincerity. It was the bursting forth of deep feeling, with all the intense anguish of wounded love. It will be the purpose of this chapter to show this, and to cause to pass before the reader's mind the time, the household, and the heart from which this cry was heard. After struggling for 17 years with ill health and every possible vexation and hindrance in his work, Professor Stowe became convinced that it was his duty to himself and his family to seek some other field of labor. February 6, 1850, he writes to his mother in Natick, Massachusetts, quote, "My health has not been good this winter, and I do not suppose that I should live long were I to stay here. I have done a great deal of hard work here, and practiced no little self-denial. I have seen the seminary carried through a most vexatious series of lawsuits, ecclesiastical and civil, and raised from the depths of poverty to comparative affluence, and I feel at liberty now to leave. During the 3 months of June, July, and August last, more than 9,000 persons died of cholera within 3 miles of my house, and this winter, in the same territory, there have been more than 10,000 cases of smallpox, many of them of the very worst kind. Several have died on the hill, and the Jesuits' college near us has been quite broken up by it. There have been, however, no cases in our families or in the seminary. I have received many letters from friends in the East expressing great satisfaction at the offer from Baldwin College and the hope that I would accept it. I am quite inclined to do so, but the matter is not yet finally settled, and there are difficulties in the way. They can offer me only $1,000 a year, and I must, out of it, hire my own house at an expense of $75 to $100 a year. Here the trustees offer me $1,500 a year if I will stay, and a good house besides, which would make the whole salary equivalent to $1,800. And today I have had another offer from New York City of $2,300. On the whole, I have written to Baldwin College, proposing to them that if they were to give me $500 free and clear in addition to the salary, I will accept their proposition, and I suppose that there is no doubt that they will do it. In that case, I should come on next spring, in May or June." This offer from Baldwin College was additionally attractive to Professor Stowe, from the fact that it was the college from which he graduated, and where some of the happiest years of his life had been passed. The professorship was one just established through the gift of Mrs. Collins, a member of Baldwin Street Church in Boston, and named in her honor the Collins Professorship of Natural and Revealed Religion. It was impossible for Professor Stowe to leave Lane Seminary till someone could be found to take his place, so it was determined that Mrs. Stowe, with 3 of the children, should start for the East in April, and having established the family in Brunswick, Professor Stowe was to come on with the remaining children when his engagements would permit. The following extracts from a letter written by Mrs. Stowe at her brother Henry's at Brooklyn, April 29, 1850, show us that the journey was accomplished without special incident. Quote, "The boat got into Pittsburgh between 4 and 5 on Wednesday. The agent for the Pennsylvania Canal came on board and soon filled out our tickets, calling my 3 chicks 1 1/2. We had a quiet and agreeable passage, and crossed the slides at 5 o'clock in the morning, amid exclamations of unbounded delight from all the children, to whom the mountain scenery was a new and amazing thing. We reached Hollidaysburg about 11 o'clock, and at 2 o'clock in the night were called up to get into the cars at Jacktown. Arriving at Philadelphia about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we took the boat and railroad line for New York. At Lancaster we telegraphed to Brooklyn, and when we arrived in New York, between 10 and 11 at night, Cousin Augustus met us and took us over to Brooklyn. We had ridden 300 miles since 2 o'clock that morning, and were very tired. I am glad we came that way, for the children have seen some of the finest scenery in our country. Henry's people are more than ever in love with him, and have raised his salary to $3,300, and given him a beautiful horse and carriage worth $600. My health is already improved by the journey, and I was able to walk a good deal between the locks on the canal. As to furniture, I think that we may safely afford an outlay of $150, and that will purchase all that may be necessary to set us up, and then we can get more as we have means and opportunity. If I got anything for those pieces I wrote before coming away, I would like to be advised thereof by you. My plan is to spend this week in Brooklyn, the next in Hartford, and the next in Boston, and go on to Brunswick sometime in May or June." End quote. May 18, 1850, we find her writing from Boston, where she is staying with her brother, Reverend Edward Beecher. Quote, "My dear husband, I came here from Hartford on Monday, and have since then been busily engaged in the business of buying and packing furniture. I expect to go to Brunswick next Tuesday night by the Bath steamer, which way I take as the cheaper. My traveling expenses, when I get to Brunswick, including everything, will have been $76. And now, lastly, my dear husband, you have never been wanting in kindness, consideration, and justice, and I want you to reflect calmly how great a work has been imposed upon me at a time when my situation particularly calls for rest, repose, and quiet. To come alone such a distance with the whole charge of children, accounts, and baggage, to push my way through hurrying crowds, looking out for trunks, and bargaining with hackmen, has been a very severe trial of my strength, to say nothing of the usual fatigues of traveling." It was at this time, and as a result of experiences of this trying period, that Mrs. Stowe wrote a little tract dear to so many Christian hearts, "Earthly Care, a Heavenly Discipline." On the eve of sailing for Brunswick, Mrs. Stowe writes to Mrs. Sykes, Miss May, "I am wearied and worn out with seeing to bedsteads, tables, chairs, mattresses, with thinking about shipping my goods and making out accounts, and I have my trunk yet to pack as I go on board the Bath steamer this evening. I beg you to look up Brunswick on the map. It is about half a day's ride in the cars from Boston. I expect to reach there by the way of Bath by tomorrow forenoon. There I have a house engaged, and kind friends who offer every hospitable assistance. Come, therefore, to see me, and we will have a long talk in the pine woods, and knit up the whole history from the place where we left it." Before leaving Boston, she had written to her husband in Cincinnati, "You are not able just now to bear anything, my dear husband. Therefore trust all to me. I never doubt or despair. I am already making arrangements with editors to raise money. I have sent some overtures to Wright. If he accepts my pieces and pays you for them, take the money and use it as you see necessary. If not, be sure and bring the pieces back to me. I am strong in spirit, and God, who has been with me in so many straits, will not forsake me now. I know him well. He is my Father, and though I may be a blind and erring child, he will help me for all that. My trust through all errors and sins is in him. He who helped poor timid Jacob through all his fears and apprehensions, who helped Abraham even when he sinned, who was with David in his wanderings, and who held up the too confident Peter when he began to sink, he will help us, and his arms are about us, so that we shall not sink, my dear husband." May 29th, 1850, she writes from Brunswick, "After a week of most incessant northeast storm, most discouraging and forlorn to the children, the sun has at length come out. There is a fair wind blowing, and every prospect, therefore, that our goods will arrive promptly from Boston, and that we shall be in our own house by next week. Mrs. Upham, wife of Professor Upham of Bodwin College, has done everything for me, giving up time and strength and taking charge of my affairs in a way without which we could not have got along at all in a strange place and in my present helpless condition. This family is delightful. There is such a perfect sweetness and quietude in all its movements. Not a harsh word or hasty expression is ever heard. It is a beautiful pattern of a Christian family, a beautiful exemplification of religion." The events of the first summer in Brunswick are graphically described by Mrs. Stowe in a letter written to her sister-in-law, Mrs. George Beecher, December 17th, 1850. "My dear sister, is it really true that snow is on the ground and Christmas coming, and I have not written unto thee, my dear sister? No, I don't believe it. I haven't been so naughty. It's all a mistake. Yes, written I must have, and written I have, too, in the night watches as I lay on my bed. Such beautiful letters. I wish you had only gotten them. But by day it has been hurry, 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 and drive, 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 or else the calm of a sick room ever since last spring. I put off writing when your letter first came, because I meant to write you a long letter, a full and complete one, and so days slid by and became weeks, and my little Charlie came, etc., and etc. Sarah, when I look back, I wonder at myself. Not that I forget any one thing that I should remember, but that I have remembered anything. From the time that I left Cincinnati with my children to come forth to a country that I knew not of, almost to the present time, it has seemed as if I could scarcely breathe, I was so pressed with care. My head dizzy with the whirl of railroads and steamboats, then 10 days' sojourn in Boston, and a constant toil and hurry in buying my furniture and equipments, and then landing in Brunswick in the midst of a dizzy, inexorable northeast storm, and beginning the work of getting in order a deserted, dreary, damp old house. All day long running from one thing to another, as for example thus: Mrs. Stowe, how shall I make this lounge, and what shall I cover the back with first? Mrs. Stowe, with the coarse cotton in the closet. Woman, Mrs. Stowe, there isn't any more soap to clean the windows. Mrs. Stowe, where shall I get soap? Here, H., run up to the store and get 2 bars. There is a man below wants to see Mrs. Stowe about the cistern. Before you go down, Mrs. Stowe, just show me how to cover this round end of the lounge. There is a man up from the depot, and he says that a box has come for Mrs. Stowe, and it's coming up to the house. Will you come down and see about it? Mrs. Stowe, don't go till you have shown the man how to nail that carpet in the corner. He's nailed it all crooked. What shall he do? The black thread is all used up, and what shall I do about putting gimp on the back of that sofa? Mrs. Stowe, there is a man come with a lot of pails and tinware from Furbish. Will you settle the bill now? Mrs. Stowe, here is a letter just come from Boston enclosing that bill of lading. The man wants to know what he shall do with the goods. If you will tell me what to say, I will answer the letter for you. Mrs. Stowe, the meat man is at the door. Hadn't we better get a little beefsteak or something for dinner? Shall Hattie go to Boardman's for some more black thread? Mrs. Stowe, this cushion is an inch too wide for the frame. What shall we do now? Mrs. Stowe, where are the screws of the black walnut bedstead? Here's the man has brought these bills for freight. Will you settle them now? Mrs. Stowe, I don't understand using this great needle. I can't make it go through the cushion. It sticks in the cotton. Then comes a letter from my husband saying he is sick abed and all but dead. Don't ever expect to see his family again. Wants to know how I shall manage in case I am left a widow. Knows we shall get in debt and never get out. Wonders at my courage. Thinks I am very sanguine. Warns me to be prudent, as there won't be much to live on in case of his death, etc., etc., etc. I read the letter and poke it into the stove and proceed. Some of my adventures were quite funny, as for example, I had in my kitchen elect no sink, cistern, or any other water privileges, so I bought at the cotton factory 2 of the great hogsheads they bring oil in, which here in Brunswick are often used for cisterns, and had them brought up in triumph to my yard, and was congratulating myself on my energy, when, lo and behold, it was discovered that there was no cellar door except one in the kitchen, which was truly a straight and narrow way down a long pair of stairs. Hereupon, as saith John Bunyan, I fell into a muse, how to get my cistern into my cellar. In days of chivalry I might have got a knight to make me a breach through the foundation walls, but that was not to be thought of now, and my oil hogsheads, standing disconsolately in the yard, seemed to reflect no great credit on my foresight. In this strait I fell upon a real honest Yankee cooper, whom I besought, for the reputation of his craft and mine, to take my hogsheads to pieces, carry them down in staves, and set them up again, which the worthy man actually accomplished one fair summer forenoon, to the great astonishment of us Yankees. When my man came to put up the pump, he stared very hard to see my hogsheads thus translated, and standing as innocent and quiet as could be in the cellar, and then I told him, in a very mild, quiet way, that I got 'em taken to pieces and put together, just as if I had been always in the habit of doing such things. Professor Stowe came down and looked very hard at them, and then said, "Well, nothing can beat a willful woman." Then followed divers negotiations with the very clever, but with reverence somewhat lazy gentleman of jobs, who occupied a carpenter's shop opposite to mine. This same John Titcomb, my very good friend, is a character peculiar to Yankeedom. He is part owner and landlord of the house I rent, and connected by birth with all the best families in town, a man of real intelligence, a good education, a great reader, and quite a thinker. Being of an ingenious turn, he does painting, gilding, staining, upholstery jobs, varnishing, all in addition to his primary trade of carpenter. But he is a man studious of ease, and fully possessed with the idea that a man wants but little here below, so he boards himself in his workshop on crackers and herring, washed down with cold water, and spends his time working, musing, reading new publications, and taking his comfort. In his shop you shall see a joiner's bench, hammers, planes, saws, gimlets, varnish, paint, picture frames, fence posts, rare old china, one or two fine portraits of his ancestry, a bookcase full of books, the tooth of a whale, an old spinning wheel and spindle, a lady's parasol frame, a church lamp to be mended. In short, Henry says Mr. Titcomb's shop is like the ocean. There is no end to the curiosities in it. In all my moving and fussing, Mr. Titcomb has been my right-hand man. Whenever a screw was loose, a nail to be driven, a lock mended, a pane of glass set, and these cases were manifold, he was always on hand. But my sink was no fancy job, and I believe nothing but a very particular friendship would have moved him to undertake it. So this same sink lingered in a precarious state for some weeks, and when I had nothing else to do, I used to call and do what I could in the way of enlisting the good man's sympathies in its behalf. How many times I have been in and seated myself in one of the old rocking chairs, and talked first of the news of the day, the railroad, the latest proceedings in Congress, the probabilities about the millennium, and thus brought the conversation by little and little round to my sink. Because till the sink was done, the pump could not be put in, and we couldn't have any rain-water. Sometimes my courage would quite fail me to introduce the subject, and I would talk of everything else, turn and get out of the shop, and then turn back as if a thought had just struck my mind, and say, "Oh, Mr. Titcomb, about that sink." "Yes, ma'am, I was thinking about going down street this afternoon to look out stuff for it." "Yes, sir, if you would be good enough to get it done as soon as possible. We are in great need of it." "I think there's no hurry. I believe we're going to have a dry time now, so that you could not catch any rain-water, and you won't need a pump at present." These negotiations extended from the 1st of June to the 1st of July, and at last my sink was completed, and so also was a new house-spout, concerning which I had had divers communings with Deacon Dunning of the Baptist Church. Also during this time good Mrs. Mitchell and myself made 2 sofas or lounges, a barrel chair, divers bedspreads, pillowcases, pillows, bolsters, mattresses. We painted rooms, we revarnished furniture, what didn't we do? Then came on Mr. Stowe, and then came the 8th of July and my little Charlie. I was really glad for an excuse to lie in bed, for I was full tired, I can assure you. Well, I was what folks call me very comfortable for 2 weeks, when my nurse had to leave me. During this time I have employed my leisure hours in making up my engagements with newspaper editors. I have written more than anybody, or I myself, would have thought. I have taught an hour a day in our school, and I have read 2 hours every evening to the children. The children study English history in school, and I am reading Scott's historical novels in their order. Tonight I finish The Abbot, shall begin Kenilworth next week, yet I am constantly pursued and haunted by the idea that I don't do anything. Since I began this note, I have been called off at least a dozen times, once for the fishman to buy a codfish, once to see a man who had brought me some barrels of apples, once to see a bookman, then to Mrs. Upman to see about a drawing I promised to make for her, then to nurse the baby, then into the kitchen to make a chowder for dinner, and now I am at it again, for nothing but deadly determination enables me ever to write. It is rowing against wind and tide. I suppose you think now I have begun, I am never going to stop. And in truth it looks like it, but the spirit moves now, and I must obey. Christmas is coming, and our little household is all alive with preparations, everyone collecting their little gifts with wonderful mystery and secrecy. To tell the truth, dear, I am getting tired. My neck and back ache, and I must come to a close. Your ready kindness to me in the spring I felt very much, and why I did not have the sense to have sent you one line just by way of acknowledgment, I'm sure I don't know. I felt just as if I had, till I awoke, and behold, I had not. But, my dear, if my wits are somewhat wool-gathering and unsettled, my heart is as true as a star. I love you, and have thought of you often. This fall I have felt often sad, lonesome, both very unusual feelings with me in these busy days. But the breaking away from my old home, and leaving father and mother, and coming to a strange place, affected me naturally. In those sad hours my thoughts have often turned to George. I have thought with encouragement of his blessed state, and hoped that I should soon be there too. I have many warm and kind friends here, and have been treated with great attention and kindness. Brunswick is a delightful residence, and if you come east next summer you must come to my new home. George, her brother's only child, would delight to go a-fishing with the children, and see the ships, and sail in the sailboats, and all that. Give Aunt Harriet's love to him, and tell him when he gets to be a painter to send me a picture. Affectionately yours, H. Stowe. End of Chapter 6, Part 1. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana.